The sun is just breaking through the trees and sending a ray of illumination through the window as a man begins to prepare his work for the day. He sets a piece of parchment onto his writing desk, trims a quill, and chooses his inks for the morning's work. The year is most likely somewhere in the vicinity of 920 AD, and this monk was probably working in the Anglo-Saxon monastery in Winchester, England. His name was Cild, and he was focused on pulling together a reference work on the known medical practices of the time into a book that will be known to us 1,000 years later as the Leechbook of Bald. Today he's working on copying down a remedy for dysentery. It's a complex series of instructions involving prayers, milk, and plants, one of the most important being blackberry. You're listening to Plant Connection. Life today can feel overwhelming, like we've drifted away from its natural rhythm. This podcast is your space to slow down, breathe, and rediscover the peace and clarity that come from reconnecting with the natural world. I'm your host, Lisa Cutshaw. Let's reconnect, one plant at a time. Now, if you're anything like me, you may be asking yourself, what the heck is a leech book, and who the heck is Bald? Now, this is not a descriptive word in this case, it's a man's name. The leech book part is simple to explain. In the Anglo-Saxon language, leech was a word that referred to a doctor, presumably because the little critters called leeches were such an important part of medical practice at the time, but some sources think the word referred to a doctor even before the little bloodsuckers became an integral part of medicine. So a leech book was a doctor's compendium of remedies. Now, Bald, on the other hand, is a little more mysterious. What we know for sure, based on a note in the manuscript itself, is that Bald was the person who asked Cild to create this book. It's suggested by some historians that Bald may have been a friend of King Alfred himself, since Winchester at the time was the most important royal church in England. In any case, the remedy they passed down to us for dysentery, at least in some respects, is one that would still make sense to a lot of herbalists. Let's look a little closer. Here's what the text says, translated into modern English, of course. Against dysentery, a bramble of which both ends are in the earth, take the newer root, delve it up, cut up 9 chips with the left hand, and sing 3 times the Miserere Mei Deus and 9 times the Pater Noster. Then take mugwort and everlasting, boil these 3 worts and the chips in milk till they get red, then let the man sip at night, fasting, a pound dish full. Let him rest himself soft and wrap himself up warm. Okay, so let's look at that a little closer. Why would a bramble have both ends in the earth? Well, blackberry canes tend to grow pretty tall, sometimes 10 feet or more, depending on the species. Around where I live, the wild blackberries often grow to 8 feet or more, and they bend over as they get tall, sometimes meaning that the growing tip at the top end of the cane ends up touching the ground. And when that happens, it can root into the soil so that the cane ends up with 2 root systems. You can also cause this to happen yourself if you want to propagate blackberry plants through this method, commonly called tip layering. Now, the remedy doesn't say the blackberry had to root itself this way naturally, so I'm guessing a lot of doctors would intentionally tip layer blackberries to have them ready when needed. So, okay, you dig up your tip layered roots, you cut 9 pieces of it off using your left hand, sing the required prayers, which, by the way, I don't speak Latin, so I hope I said them right. Throw your blackberry root pieces into boiling milk along with some mugwort and everlasting, which is just another name for straw flower, a type of helichrysum, until they turn red. That night, your patient, who should be fasting, can sip a bowl full of the boiled milk while resting and cozying up in a blanket. For modern herbalists and many Native American tribes alike, a tea made of blackberry is all it takes to make a treatment for diarrhea. Presumably, that was a large part of the efficacy of Bald's remedy for dysentery. The mugwort would be anti-inflammatory, so it might offer some pain relief. And the helichrysum does have some antimicrobial effects, so I wonder if that might even start to help the immune system defeat the root cause of the dysentery. I don't know, but it's interesting to speculate. The Anglo-Saxons and Native Americans weren't alone in using blackberry for its medicinal properties. As far back as ancient Greece, Hippocrates recommended soaking blackberry leaves in wine to use as an astringent poultice on wounds. Now, of course, for me, like probably most of us, blackberry is pretty much mostly a yummy summertime treat. The pasture around my house is full of blackberry canes in flower at the moment. It's late May as I record this, so we have a couple of months before any of the fruit will start to ripen. And once it does, I and the wildlife will compete to see who can get the ripest, juiciest ones first. Just kidding, there's plenty to go around, so we'll all get some. Blackberries have always been a big part of summertime for my family, and that's been true for the people in the Blue Ridge since time immemorial. I remember as a kid, I might have been 5 or 6, I'm not sure. I was certainly old enough to carry a big bowl. My grandma and I set out from the house to pick blackberries to make cobbler. If I was 5, then my grandma was 70, and she knew where to find a good haul of berries. We walked up the road past the old church and onto the hill behind it. The brambles had nearly hidden a little old house that everyone in the family called the cottage. I remember asking about it, and my grandma telling me who had built it and who had lived there, all while reminding me not to eat all my berries if I wanted to have enough to make a cobbler. Of course, she had brought a bowl too, so I'm pretty sure we still would have gotten cobbler even if I ate all of mine. But I didn't. We carried our bowls back home, and I helped make the cobbler in the way little kids do, mostly watching and asking why we did each step. It was fun, and one of the few memories I have of doing something with my grandma outside the house, just the two of us. Cobbler, if you've never had it, is kind of like a quick and easy version of a fruit pie. Instead of having to make a pastry crust, you mix up your fruit with a little sugar, dump it in a baking dish, drop spoonfuls of biscuit dough on top, and bake it until the biscuit dough has a golden brown crust. Now that's biscuit in the American sense, of course, no cookie dough involved. Cobbler is one of the great desserts of summer, in my opinion, with blackberry being the best kind of all. Now I'm happy to test that, though, if anyone wants to bring over a different variety. The downside to blackberries, you could say, is the thorns. They like to remind me of their existence every time I walk through the pasture, which can be pretty painful, so I try to keep a path cleared with the weed eater. You know, I thought my goofy little goats would clear the whole pasture for me, but they don't seem to consider that a priority. The part behind the house stays pretty clear, but the other half does not seem to be on their radar. Anyway, there's an interesting legend in parts of Europe, especially the British Isles, that blackberries cannot be eaten if picked after October 10th, which was the date of Michaelmas in the old calendar, before everyone switched to the current Gregorian calendar. The legend goes that when the devil was banished from heaven, he fell to earth and landed in a blackberry bramble. Ouch, right? Well, Michaelmas was the feast day that celebrated that event. So the idea was if you ate blackberries after that date, the fruit would be cursed and someone in your family would get sick or die. Pretty dark, but to be honest, you probably wouldn't want to eat any of the berries left by then anyway, or at least I wouldn't, because they get mushy or dried out or buggy. The thing is that may well be the heart of the prohibition, since eating berries full of worms and such might make you sick. Ecologically, blackberries are an important food source for all sorts of wildlife, from bears all the way down to caterpillars. There are roughly 375 different species native across the temperate regions of North America, Europe, and Asia, and they tend to be one of those species that can quickly occupy an opening. Cut down some trees, bulldoze for a parking lot, whatever you do that opens up a sunny space where they can thrive, blackberry can quickly take over. If you're growing them for berry production, you have around 500 named varieties to choose from, though your local garden center probably won't carry more than half a dozen unless they specialize in fruit varieties. Of the older varieties, most of the favorites for taste will have thorns on the canes, because efforts to produce a thornless variety usually ended up in berries that didn't have much flavor. Some of the newer thornless varieties have been able to keep the flavor, though, so they may be worth exploring. Another recent innovation among breeders was primocane fruiting. So what does that mean, and why does it matter? Well, blackberry plants send up canes from the rootstock. Each of those tall stems that arch over is a cane, and those canes don't usually bear fruit the first year. First-year canes are what they call primocanes. Now in the wild, you may not even notice that some canes aren't producing fruit, because there will be so many older canes mixed in. But if you are establishing a garden plot of blackberries, having to wait 2 years to get fruit can feel like a long time. So for those who don't want to wait, look into some of the primocane fruiting varieties. I haven't tried them myself, but online sources say that some of them have good flavor. And honestly, I can't imagine why you'd want to grow blackberries if they don't have good flavor. Another thing to think about for gardening is which form the canes will take when growing. Some have upright canes that don't tend to need staking. Others are semi-erect and still others are trailing. So both of those types will need support to keep the garden easy to walk through and manage. So when can you expect your fruit? The canes will probably start flowering in April, and July through September is the standard fruiting period, but each variety has its own variation on that theme. So maybe the biggest question people ask, what's the difference between a blackberry and a raspberry? For this, we want to look at the fruit itself. With a blackberry, the receptacle stays with the berry when it's picked, so it feels like a solid, full fruit. With a raspberry, the receptacle stays on the plant, so a raspberry has a hollow space where the receptacle used to be. That's why you'll sometimes hear people call them red caps or black caps, depending on which type of raspberry they are, because they look like a cap. And once you have your bowls and buckets filled with blackberries, what do you like to do with them? My favorite is to eat them fresh, but cobbler and jam are always welcome at our house. If you have more than you can use, you can always pop them in a freezer-safe container and have them to use for the rest of the year. Now for me, blackberry is one of the great symbols of summertime bounty, and I hope that you get to enjoy picking some of them this year. Thank you for joining me on this journey back to nature with Plant Connection. If this episode resonated with you, be sure to tap subscribe or follow on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss the next episode. See you next time.